Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you to the London Central Mosque and to Beacon Books for putting this conference together, and everyone else for coming. Those familiar with Pickthall's story will know he lived an extraordinary life situated in extraordinary times. An accomplished author, journalist, and in later years, an Islamic scholar and translator, he was a man who wore many hats, or perhaps more accurately, wrote with many pens. For it is these words that resonate with us a century after they were first written. Pickthall was born on April the 7th, 1875, on Cambridge Terrace, London, which is actually just a mile away from where we're sitting now, on the eastern side of Regent's Park. He was the son of Mary O'Brien and the Reverend Charles Pickthall, an Anglican priest, who served in the small village of Chilsford in Suffolk. I don't know if this works. Yeah. So this is the village and the church that he would have served at. This is his father. This is a young Marmaduke there. Pickthall's father died when he was 5, after which the family left their home in rural Suffolk to a small flat in London. And this was the first of a series of spiritual contractions and expansions, affirming the Quranic verse, Inna ma'al usri yusra, that Pickthall went throughout his life. So this move had a stifling effect on the soul of the young Marmaduke, who, according to his first biographer, saw the move from country to city as a casting out of paradise. A similar sense of spiritual suppression was incited during his school years, particularly those spent at Harrow. This is not actually him, but those are those years. Where his conscientious and shy nature was ill-suited to the boisterous culture of British private school. One of his final novels, Solipidus, is littered with critiques of that system and the leaders it bore, many of whom he was educated alongside, including Sir Winston Churchill. So these struggles were soothed by summers spent touring Europe with his mother, where he fostered his love of languages. And he was said to be able to translate from up to 12 languages in later life. This aptitude for languages allowed Pickthall to engage deeply with the different people, cultures, and ideas he encountered during his lifetime. After finishing school, Pickthall was faced what his second biographer, Peter Clarke, described as a nervous breakdown. Successive failures to enter government service left Pickthall facing a cul-de-sac. He was given the choice of either returning to Harrow or to accompany a family friend to Palestine. And as always, he chose the path less travelled. After spending some weeks in Cairo, he travelled on to Jaffa in Palestine, where he met the Reverend Hanor, who was an English clergyman born in Jerusalem, who spoke fluent Arabic. The Reverend would teach Pickthall his first Arabic words and support him in his desire to meet Palestinians. Pickthall wrote how the Palestinians were treated as objects of suspicion by British residents, prejudices that were the secret joy of youth to disobey. His dissonance was facilitated by Suleiman, a Syrian dragoman, with whom Pickthall explored the hinterlands of what was then the Ottoman domains of modern-day Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, historically Bilad al-Sham. Through his travels, Pickthall glimpsed traces of a way of life that he sensed was being eroded by European incursion. As he wrote in his introduction to Oriental Encounters, 20 years later, in all my previous years, I had not seen happy people. These were happy people. Poor they might be, but they had no dream of wealth. The very thought of competition was unknown to them. Wages and rent were troubles they had never heard of. Class distinctions, as we understand them, were not. Everybody talked to everybody. With inequality, they had true fraternity. I had a vision of the tortured peoples of the earth, i.e. the Europeans, impelled by their own misery to desolate the happy peoples, a vision which grew clearer in the years after. But in that easygoing Eastern life, there is a power of resistance, as everybody knows who tries to change it, which may yet defeat the hosts of joyless drudgery. We see in these recollections how an episode of youthful rebellion would in time crystallize into a more mature stream of thought, in which Pickthall juxtaposes the ethical and humane features of Eastern life against the internal poverty of European civilization, whose so-called civilizing mission drove their process of colonialization. Pickthall's resistance to that loss of life, particularly the inward prosperity it fostered, was key to his later spiritual, intellectual, and political realignments. So from his earliest novels and personal accounts, it becomes clear that Pickthall understood and considered the ulama, the scholars of Islam, to be the guardians of this ethical and humane social system. He is likely to have discerned the centrality of the ulama in Muslim society through his interactions with the mysterious figure of his sheikh in Damascus, under whose influence he almost became Muslim. Pickthall wrote, yes, so this is not confirmed, but around this time he would have been the sheikh. That is him, but it's not necessarily Pickthall's sheikh. He never said who this was, but this would have been, as you'll see, he did write that his Muslim teacher, the Sheikh al-Ulama of the great Mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque, which could have been this man here, the sheikh, was a noble and benign old man. He reminded me of my duty to my mother and forbade me to profess Islam until I had consulted her. So he actually dissuaded Pickthall from converting to Islam at that stage. "No, my son," were his words, "wait until you are older and have seen again your native land. You're alone among us, as our boys are alone among the Christians. God knows how I should feel if any Christian teacher dealt with a son of mine otherwise than I now deal with you." This spiritual largesse had a profound effect on Pickthall, and he often compared his sheikh's religious tolerance to the fanaticism he felt governed Christian relations with both non-Christians and different Christian denominations themselves. So upon returning home, Pickthall married his childhood sweetheart, Muriel Smith. It's a blurry picture, but that is Muriel and Marmaduke, later years. Muriel, though aware of her husband's wanderlust, cannot have envisioned the path she was now destined to traverse, taking her from the Swiss Alps to the sunny shores of Bombay, from Christianity to Islam, which she accepted in the years after Marmaduke's conversion. Striking images are evoked when reading of the Pickthals. One can imagine them boarding the Khalifa special train bound for the Indian National Congress. Muriel, the only woman on a train filled with India's most prominent independence figures. She was engaged in several ventures during her time in India, from her role in the women's wing of the non-cooperation movement to her position as the boarding mistress of Hyderabad's Civil Service House, a nursery for the training of Hyderabad's civil servants. It is fitting that her influence is inscribed even in Pickthall's greatest achievement, his translation of the Quran, which she compiled the index of. Muriel trod a path, while the broad contours of her life were greatly influenced by her husband's, she trod a path that paralleled rather than trailed his. We are left to wonder about her experiences after his death. A female convert living alone on the wild and isolated coast of North Cornwall. The couple settled for a time in Suffolk, where Pickthall wrote a string of best-selling novels. He would go on to write over 20, and many of them have been reprinted by Beacon Books. They're available today, and it's a good venture worth supporting. But as the First World War neared, Pickthall's literature took a back seat. He became increasingly invested in the political causes of the day. He was a supporter of Disraeli's pro-Ottoman policy, which viewed the maintenance of Ottoman power as a necessary safeguard against the greater threat of an expansionist Russian empire to the east. For Pickthall, though, he was deeply concerned that the breakdown of Anglo-Ottoman relations would not only upset the dynamics of the Ottoman Empire itself, but would also disgruntle some 94 million Muslims that were part of the British Empire at the time, which consisted of roughly half the world's Muslim population, I believe, if I'm not wrong. A key event in Pickthall's politicisation was the muted European coverage and concern for the reported massacres of Ottomans in the Balkans by Christian forces in the 1912 and 1913 Balkan Wars. In that spring, Pickthall embarked on a fact-finding mission to determine the extent of Ottoman casualties and also to bring back news that could sway British public opinion. His time in Istanbul exposed him to harrowing stories of Ottoman refugees and soldiers that were returning from the Balkans. It also brought him into contact with the leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, the foremost faction of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. Pickthall returned back to the UK, convinced that the European powers were complicit in the massacres of Ottomans, which fueled his activism in support of the emerging Ottoman leadership. Pickthall's anguish at the defeats and atrocities suffered by Ottomans contrasted sharply with the public glee he encountered on arriving home. At the small Sussex church in which he worshipped, he listened on as Ottoman defeats were described as victories for Christendom against an enduring Saracen foe. Amidst the lyrics of Charles Wesley's Hymn for the Mahatmans, he reached the end of his endurance. We read, "O may thy blood once sprinkled cry, for those who spurn thy sprinkled blood, assert thy glorious deity, stretch out thine arm, thou triune God, the Unitarian fiend expel, and chase his doctrines back to hell." Pickthall rose from his pew and departed the church and Christianity for good. Back in London, Pickthall immersed himself in various pan-Islamic causes, helping to establish several Ottoman committees engaged in lobbying British foreign policy. This stance proved problematic when the Ottomans allied with the Germans in the First World War. Muslims, who then counted for well over half the British Empire's total population, were sorely tested during this period, as to the extent they could maintain a dual allegiance to both Crown and Caliphate. For Pickthall and Britain's diverse, fledgling Muslim communities of disparate sailors, students, civil servants and converts, this was a source of increasing social marginalisation. As Pickthall relates, in defending an unpopular cause, I have had to fear and have encountered public ridicule and private abuse. In time, this developed into state suspicion and even surveillance, as Pickthall was linked to the so-called Woking Mosque gang, described by intelligence reports as a diffuse group of anti-British agitators, in communication with all the most dangerous conspirators in the country and abroad. It was in this intense atmosphere in November 1917 that Pickthall finally took his Shahada. Then, over 40, he was immediately given leadership roles in the Muslim organisations across London. He gave khutbahs at various mosques, led the Tarawih and Eid prayers at the Woking Mosque, and he also served as imam there for a time. He was editing journals such as the Islamic Review and the Muslim Outlook, and he also found time to continue writing novels. Two of these contain important insights into his understanding of the role of politics and religion in society. The first of these is The Nights of Araby, written in 1917, a novel that dramatises a historic conflict between rival dynasties in the Yemeni city of Zabid in the 12th century. It is particularly concerned with the question of ethics, which Pickthall derived from the traditional Islamic sources of law, the Quran, Hadith, Ijma', scholarly consensus, and Qiyas, deductive reasoning. Pickthall embeds these ethical principles into the novel through the stories of several saints, whose lives demonstrate how Islam's highest ethical principles can be realized. The first stage of this process of sainthood is portrayed in the novel through individual moral refinement, which is connected to the trials and tribulations that the novel's saints undergo. These struggles act as a kiln that extinguishes the base qualities of the ego, transforming them into the virtues of a purified heart, qalbi salim. This process is but a stage on the way to realizing the higher ethical demands of the religion, the most important of which in Pickthall's mind was the virtue of service, particularly the paths of sacred knowledge and politics. So the path of knowledge for Pickthall is embedded in the stories of the ulama. Offering a longer view of history, Pickthall wrote that to accept not only the scientific knowledge and achievements of the West, but also its social and political ideals, is suicidal madness. Such thinking brought Pickthall into line with thinkers such as the philosopher-poet Muhammad Iqbal and the Austrian convert Muhammad Asad, who took over from Pickthall in Hyderabad writing this journal. The former wrote, "For all their repertory of varied charms, I will take nothing from Europe except a warning. You enchained to the imitation of Europe, be free. Clutch the skirt of the Quran and be free." Time and again, Pickthall drew from his diverse skill set to serve the cause of Islam, be it in his writing, journalism, activism, or scholarship. His efforts culminated in what was arguably his most significant work, his translation of the Quran, the first authored by an English Muslim. Muslim translations of the Quran had historically been subsumed within the larger discipline of tafsir, rather than being standalone works. It was Europeans who produced the first independent translations, arguably as early as the 12th century. In the colonial age, the nature and use of European translations of the Quran had changed. Rather than being consigned to internal European polemics, they began being employed by Christian missionaries in their proselytization of Indian Muslims. The prejudices embedded in these works and their polemical application provoked Muslims to author their own translations. Pickthall's translation followed suit, and we read in his foreword that Islam has been attacked and prejudiced by means of translations of the Quran, produced with the plain intention of discrediting it. His translation aimed to correct these prejudices and also improve the literary standard of existing translations produced by Muslims. His translation was widely acclaimed for its accuracy and remains in print and popular to this day. After a decade of service, Pickthall returned home, where he would die in St Ives, Cornwall, on May the 19th, 1936. He was buried at the Muslim cemetery in Brookwood. Clearing his desk, Muriel found the last lines he had written before his death. And they read from the Quran, "Whosoever surrendereth his purpose to Allah while doing good, his reward is with his Lord, and there shall no fear come upon them, neither shall they grieve."